Hello, I'm Phillip Taylor from Richmond Green Chambers. I'm talking about this book about Captain George Vancouver, Royal Navy. This is the book. It's a fairly small one, some very nice pictures in it, in fact in part. It's a very interesting biography. It's called Captain Vancouver, Northwest Navigator by Ernie Coleman. It was published some years ago at the time of the 200th anniversary of his death, and it's now been republished, and in fact there's another book about Captain Vancouver also available in the United States. Let me tell you a bit about the book. The title I've given for this review is Captain Vancouver's Remarkable Rim Adventures, because what he did is he navigated the Pacific Rim area, and this is the rim of Northwest America, so it's the East Pacific Rim. It's a delight to review this book because it's the first full-scale book that we've actually had about Captain Vancouver, and it was commissioned around the time, as I say, of his 200th anniversary of his death. He's buried locally where I live, in a village called Petersham, which is just on the banks of the River Thames near Twickenham, but in fact part of Richmond town today. It's about a man who's not widely known. The name is known, but he's not widely known. His exploits, in fact, are virtually unknown to many people, although we've used the maps that he created until very recently, and they have been absolutely superb. They were high quality pieces of work, and it's only with the digital era that slightly different changes have taken place, but his maps were in use for well over 200 years. Let's say Captain Vancouver is actually buried in the historic St. Peter's Church in Petersham, and he came to this area as a fatally ill man at the end of his expeditions. He died at the age of 40, and obviously he worked very hard right till the end of his life to complete details of his journey and the work that he'd been commissioned to do by the Admiralty. Ernie Coleman has done a lot of research into George Vancouver. It's extensive and it covers in detail the precise nature which Vancouver had when tending to his mission. The mission itself is a gallant story of enterprise and initiative. Obviously there were difficult moments. It was a pretty awful life at that particular time in the Royal Navy. In the original edition, unfortunately, there's no index which would aid reference, but there are one or two problems, because obviously the one area where Captain Vancouver had a problem was he suffered stalking. A person called William Camelford, who was an aristocrat, in fact had a vendetta against Vancouver. One of the reasons being was that Vancouver had him flogged. The details are relatively sketchy in this work, whereas in other works which have come on the market since, it identifies that in fact Vancouver's decision was somewhat controversial, and it was a matter obviously which led to a court case. I think the interesting area when you're looking at the character of George Vancouver is to see the history of his relatively short life, because he sailed with Captain Cook, and in fact Coleman talks in a very sensitive way about how Captain James Cook was killed, and obviously that was something which I think shook up a lot of people, and the effect that it had on Midshipman Vancouver must have been very substantial. The one thing that comes out of this book, and also the other ones that I've read, is that whatever one thinks of Vancouver, and he was a tough taskmaster, he did care for his men, and he cared for them deeply, And in fact, survival, which he thought, and he's right of course, when he says it means teamwork, it's exactly what it means when you're up against the elements. And obviously the issue when it comes to looking after the men is to make sure they survive, and he had a very good record of keeping his guys alive. And that sense of care in fact comes through in the book, and you can measure the feeling obviously from the type of work that he was doing, the monotony of the work, and the painstaking efforts to identify and map the whole of the beautiful coastline, going all the way up past Vancouver city itself, way up north. I can picture well from reading the book how things must have been. Remember, these guys are all a very long way from home, 10,000 miles away. I've been to Vancouver myself and I know it. It's a beautiful part of the world, but it is the other side of the world. And this particular book brings that out. I said earlier about Vancouver's care for his crew. Only one person died during that particular voyage, and that was from disease, and that was a 4-year mission. And I think the Discovery, which was the name of his ship, bore up pretty well, bearing in mind there'd been other much more explosive incidents in the Royal Navy in contemporary times. Well, it's a great read, this book. I met Ernie Coleman, who's a charming ex-sailor. He knows his stuff. I was impressed with the amount of commitment he had to the work. I read this book, and I also read Charles Darwin's book, The Voyage of the Beagle, which I found also fascinating, but in a slightly different way. Obviously the English is rather more formal, but it's interesting. Darwin, who we're celebrating as an anniversary of his birth at the moment, has been immortalised for his Origin of Species book and his concepts. Vancouver's name, of course, has been immortalised in a slightly different way from both the north and south shores of the American Pacific Rim. Obviously the main city is named after him, and as I've said, this is a book that's worth reading. It's not just a book for the naval historian, it's much more general in its applicability. It's an adventure book of readable workmanship. I said originally, get it while stocks last. Well, they sold out the first one, and this is the original with the beautiful print of his picture on. And it's now in a reprinted edition, but it's worth reading. As I say, they were remarkable adventures around the rim, and it's well worth reading. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.